Well, folks, let me tell you something. When the commander-in-chief threatens to execute members of Congress for reminding soldiers to follow the law, you know we've crossed into dangerous territory. But here's what Trump didn't count on: the military fighting back. And I'm not talking about some junior enlisted folks or random veterans on Twitter. I'm talking about Army commanders, Navy intelligence officers, and a retired Air Force judge who just dropped one of the most devastating comparisons I've ever heard about what happens when soldiers blindly follow orders. Trump lost his mind this week, posted on Truth Social that 6 Democratic lawmakers committed seditious behavior punishable by death. And what was their crime? What did they do that deserves execution according to Trump? They made a simple video reminding service members that they can refuse illegal orders, that they must refuse illegal orders, that following the Uniform Code of Military Justice isn't optional. That's it. That's what Trump considers worthy of death. Explaining military law to the military, reminding soldiers they took an oath to the Constitution, not to him personally, stating basic facts about what service members are required to do when given illegal orders. And Trump's response was to call for their hanging. Actually reposted someone saying George Washington would have hanged them all, then added his own post saying seditious behavior punishable by death. But here's where it gets interesting. The military isn't having it. Veterans from every branch are speaking out, using their credibility, their experience, their understanding of military law to push back. And what they're saying is devastating to Trump's claims. Absolutely devastating. Start with Skylar Early, Army veteran and advocate. She cuts right to the heart of Trump's hypocrisy. Says Trump, screaming sedition because Democratic veterans made a message that the military can disobey unlawful orders, conveying the Uniform Code of Military Justice is not sedition. Then delivers the knockout punch. January 6th was sedition, and Trump pardoned them all. Think about that. Trump calls reminding soldiers to follow law sedition. But attacking the Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power, that's patriotism worthy of pardons. The inversion is complete. Defending the Constitution is treason, attacking it is heroism. Following law is sedition, breaking it is loyalty. Everything is backwards in Trump's world. But then Pete Buttigieg weighs in. Former Navy intelligence officer, guy who actually served and understands military culture from the inside, and what he says is crucial for understanding why Trump's attacks are so dangerous. Buttigieg explains that as an officer, he was taught to obey all lawful orders. Lawful orders. That's the key phrase. That's what the oath says. That's what military training emphasizes. Not all orders, lawful orders. The distinction isn't small. It's fundamental. It's what separates professional militaries from tools of tyranny. And Buttigieg explains that he was taught if he was ever ordered to do anything unlawful, his responsibility was to the law and to the Constitution, not to the person giving the order, not to political loyalty, to law and Constitution. That's what the oath means. That's what military service requires. Then Buttigieg makes a crucial observation. Says we've always assumed that if a president ordered something blatantly illegal or unconstitutional, that order wouldn't go far. Wouldn't get anywhere near the soldier or sailor or airman or Marine in the field. Because senior military leadership, generals whose job is to be completely non-political, would not allow it to happen. That's the safeguard. That's what's supposed to prevent illegal orders from being carried out. Professional military leadership that understands law and Constitution and refuses to pass along orders that violate them. That's the institutional protection service members have always relied on. But then Buttigieg drops the bomb. Says one of the first things this president did was change senior military leadership, and maybe even more importantly, change the JAG Corps. The lawyers who advise generals and admirals on what to do, the people whose job is to say when something's illegal, the institutional safeguard that's supposed to prevent illegal orders. Trump fired them, replaced them, removed the people who might say no, and that creates pressure down the chain of command. Creates uncertainty for anybody worried about whether everything they're being ordered to do is lawful and constitutional. Removes the protection service members have always had. That's why the Democratic lawmakers' video matters. That's why reminding service members they can refuse illegal orders is necessary. Because the institutional safeguards are being dismantled. The people who would normally prevent illegal orders from being given are being removed. And service members are being left exposed, isolated, uncertain about whether they can trust their chain of command to protect them from being ordered to do things that violate law. But the most powerful response came from Morris Davis, retired Air Force colonel, former chief prosecutor of the Air Force, former military judge, guy who spent his career in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the legal arm of the military, someone who knows military law better than almost anyone. And Davis starts by talking about Auschwitz, about the Holocaust, about Rudolf Höss, who commanded the death camp where more than 1 million people were murdered, about Höss's defense at Nuremberg. And what he quotes is chilling. Höss said, "Don't you see? We SS men were not supposed to think about those things. It just never occurred to us. We were all so trained to obey orders without even thinking that the thought of disobeying an order would simply never have occurred to anybody. And somebody else would have done just as well if I hadn't. I never really gave much thought to whether it was wrong. It just seemed a necessity." That's the defense. That's what Höss said when confronted with participating in genocide. Just following orders. Never thought to question. Someone else would have done it if I hadn't. Didn't think about whether it was wrong. Just seemed necessary. And that defense didn't work. That's what Nuremberg established. That following orders is not a defense for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, for violations of basic legal and moral principles. Soldiers have an obligation to refuse illegal orders. Can't hide behind claims they were just doing what they were told. That principle exists for a reason. Exists because we learned at terrible cost what happens when soldiers follow illegal orders without question. When obedience becomes more important than law. When duty to superiors overrides duty to humanity. We learn that leads to atrocities, to horrors, to the kind of crimes that make civilization impossible. And Davis connects this directly to what's happening now. Says 6 Democratic members of Congress, all of whom served in uniform or in the CIA, posted a video reminding service members they have a legal obligation to disobey unlawful orders. That if they're ordered to attack American civilians or ordered to murder fishermen off the coast of Venezuela, they have a duty to disobey because it's unlawful. Those aren't hypotheticals. Those are references to actual Trump administration policies, to deployments that courts have blocked as illegal, to airstrikes that military lawyers said violate law, to orders that service members are actually being given. The video isn't abstract. It's addressing real situations service members are facing right now. And Davis points out that Nuremberg showed relying on the "I was just ordered to do it" defense doesn't work. Can't protect you from prosecution, can't excuse violations of law. Service members need to understand that. Need to know that following illegal orders can lead to being held personally responsible. So what was Trump's response to this reminder of established military law? Stephen Miller said Democrats are inciting insurrection. Trump himself said it was seditious behavior that warranted execution. Called for members of Congress to be killed for explaining the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And Davis nails the projection. Says Republicans always whine that Democrats are inciting violence. But you can tell the things they complain about are the things they do themselves. And that's exactly what's happening here. Holding Democratic members of Congress up for telling the truth and saying they should be murdered for doing it. Then Davis gets personal. Says when he served in the JAG Corps, he served alongside Roger Wicker and Lindsey Graham, 2 senators who are now in Congress. 2 men who know military law, who've taught service members about unlawful orders, who understand everything the Democratic lawmakers said is correct. And Davis is blunt. Says there are some people who are just stupid and fall for Trump's lies. But Wicker and Graham know better. They're lawyers. They're veterans. They understand military law. But they've made the decision that it's in their interest to go along, to stay silent about Trump's threats, to enable rather than condemn. That's moral failure. That's choosing political expediency over professional obligation. That's abandoning principles you once believed in strongly enough to teach them to others. And it matters, because when people who know better stay silent, when professionals abdicate responsibility, when former military lawyers won't defend military law, that enables Trump to keep making threats. Then Davis asks the question everyone should be asking. If the president calling for execution of members of Congress for telling the truth isn't grounds for impeachment, then what the hell is? If threatening to kill lawmakers for explaining military law doesn't warrant removal, what does? Where's the line? What would Trump have to do to make Congress say this is too far? And Davis says if he was serving in Congress, he'd be filing articles of impeachment right now, because this isn't just inappropriate rhetoric. This isn't just Trump being Trump. This is the commander-in-chief threatening death for anyone who reminds service members they must follow law. That's impeachable. That's grounds for removal. That's behavior that can't be tolerated in a democracy. But Congress won't impeach, won't even condemn the threats, because Republicans control both chambers and Republicans won't cross Trump, won't defend their own members, won't stand up for principles they claim to believe in. Will stay silent while the president threatens execution of lawmakers for doing their constitutional duty. And that's why Davis's final point matters so much. Says Trump is a dangerous man. The mob he unleashed on January 6th is perfect example of the deadly chaos he's capable of inciting with his words. 9 people connected to the events of that day have perished. And here he is again, turning up the heat with his pathological twisting of truth. But the attack is backfiring. Not only is Trump reminding the world of the unhinged person he is, but veterans from Army, Navy, and Air Force are pushing back. Their message is unmistakable. Following the Constitution is not sedition, and refusing illegal orders from a dictatorial tyrant abusing his power just might be the highest form of service at this moment in history. That's the response Trump provoked. That's what happens when you threaten execution of lawmakers for explaining military law. Veterans with credibility, with expertise, with understanding of what military service actually means, using their voices to push back, to defend the lawmakers, to remind everyone what the oath requires, to stand up for principles under attack. And their response matters. Matters because they can't be dismissed as partisan hacks. Can't be claimed to not understand military culture, can't be suggested to be putting politics above country when they're the ones who actually served. Their voices carry weight that civilian voices, no matter how correct, can't match. Schuyler Early reminding everyone that January 6th was the real sedition, and Trump pardoned everyone involved. Buttigieg explaining how Trump has systematically removed the institutional safeguards that prevent illegal orders. Davis connecting Trump's demands for blind obedience to the same defense that didn't work at Nuremberg. All of it coming from people who know what they're talking about, who've lived it, who understand military law because they've operated under it. That's what Trump is up against. Not just Democrats making political arguments, but veterans defending principles they believe in. Military lawyers explaining law they spent careers upholding. Service members standing up for the oath they took. All of them saying clearly, the Democratic lawmakers were right, Trump's threats are wrong, and service members must refuse illegal orders. And that message is getting through. The video clips are going viral. The explanations are being shared. Service members are seeing people they respect, veterans they trust, explaining that the Democratic lawmakers were correct, that refusing illegal orders is required, that following the Constitution is duty, that Trump's threats are unconscionable. That creates space, creates permission for service members to follow their oaths, gives them cover to refuse illegal orders, reminds them they're not alone, that there are people who've worn the uniform who will support them if they do the right thing. That courage is possible. That duty to the Constitution is real. And it's exactly what Trump doesn't want. Doesn't want service members thinking critically about orders, doesn't want space for questioning legality, doesn't want veterans with credibility explaining that his threats are wrong, wants blind obedience, wants military as his personal tool, wants anyone who suggests limits on his power to be silenced. But the veterans speaking out are showing that silencing doesn't have to work, that speaking up is possible, that defending principles is worth the risk, that courage exists, that not everyone will be intimidated, and that matters, not just for the immediate situation, but for establishing that resistance is possible, that Trump's threats don't have to be accepted, that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed and people willing to defend those lines, that democracy doesn't have to collapse just because one person wants unlimited power. Every time someone speaks up despite the risk, They make it easier for the next person. Every time a veteran explains military law despite Trump's threats, they encourage service members to follow that law. Every time someone with credibility defends the principle that illegal orders must be refused, they strengthen that principle. That's how institutions survive. Not through dramatic gestures, but through steady, consistent defense of principles by people willing to accept personal cost to do what's right, through veterans using their credibility to protect service members, through military lawyers defending military law, through everyone who understands what's at stake choosing to speak up. Because the alternative is silence, and silence enables Trump, allows him to keep threatening, allows institutional degradation to continue, allows America to become weaker while pretending to become stronger. And none of these veterans are willing to accept that. Not Early, not Buttigieg, not Davis, not any of the others speaking out. They understand what's at stake. Understand that this is about more than politics, about whether the military remains professional and non-political, about whether service members can trust they won't be ordered to commit crimes, about whether presidential power is constrained by law, about whether America remains what we claim to be. And they're using their voices, their expertise, their credibility to defend those principles, to stand up for service members, to push back against Trump's threats, to remind everyone what the oath means and what military service requires. That's courage. That's integrity. That's what defending democracy looks like when it's under attack. And it's working. The message is getting through. The pushback is resonating. The defense of principles is making a difference. Not because it's easy, not because it's without risk, but because it's necessary. Because some things are worth defending even when it's costly. Because democracy requires people willing to stand up when standing up matters most. That's what these veterans are doing. That's what their response to Trump's threats represents. That's why their voices matter so much right now. Because they're defending not just the Democratic lawmakers who were threatened, but the principles that make America what it is, the belief that power is constrained by law, that service members follow the Constitution, not presidential whim, that explaining military law isn't sedition but duty. And if enough people join them, if enough voices speak up, if enough courage is shown, then Trump's threats will fail, will prove unable to silence, will demonstrate that intimidation doesn't work when people refuse to be intimidated. That's the hope. That's the goal. That's what these veterans are fighting for. And they deserve support. Deserve to know they're not alone. Deserve to have others join them in defending principles that matter more than politics. Because this isn't about party. Isn't about whether you like Democrats or Republicans. This is about whether threatening execution for explaining law is acceptable. Whether service members should follow illegal orders. Whether America is still governed by Constitution or by presidential decree. Those are questions that transcend politics, that matter for everyone, that determine what kind of country we are and what kind of country we'll become. And answering them correctly requires the courage these veterans are showing, the willingness to speak up, the commitment to principles, the refusal to accept that this is normal. That's what gives me hope, not certainty, but hope, that enough people will find that courage, that enough veterans will speak up, that enough Americans will recognize what's at stake and refuse to accept Trump's vision of unlimited presidential power. Because the alternative is unthinkable, and we're better than that. We have to be. Because if we're not, if we accept that threatening execution for explaining law is acceptable, then we've lost what makes America worth defending. And these veterans aren't willing to lose that, aren't willing to stay silent, aren't willing to let Trump's threats go unchallenged, are using their voices to defend principles they believe in and service members who need protection. That's what military service means. Not just wearing the uniform, but defending the Constitution even after you take it off. Standing up for principles even when it's risky. Using whatever credibility and expertise you have to protect what matters. And they're doing it. Right now, in response to Trump's threats, defending the lawmakers, defending military law, defending the principle that illegal orders must be refused, defending democracy itself. That's the story. That's what's happening. That's why it matters. And that's why everyone who cares about these principles needs to support them, amplify their voices, and join them in saying, Trump's threats are wrong, the lawmakers were right, and following the Constitution is not sedition.